There is a moment, and most people miss it completely, when a royal guard blinks. Not the slow, deliberate blink of someone resting. Not the lazy flutter of a man lost in thought. This is the blink of someone fighting. The kind of blink that happens when the body is screaming at the mind, and the mind is screaming back. Not yet, not yet, just a little longer. I only noticed it because I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the right place. I still haven't decided. It was a Thursday in late October. The kind of morning that hasn't made up its mind yet. Cold enough for a coat, but not cold enough for gloves. Gray sky doing that thing where it threatens rain, but never quite commits. I had arrived at the Horse Guards parade earlier than I expected because my two connection worked out perfectly, which almost never happens in London. So I had time. And because I had time, I stood still. And because I stood still, I started watching. What I saw over the next 3 hours changed something in me that I'm not entirely sure I can name. 2. Set Up Horse Guards Parade sits just off Whitehall, tucked between St. James's Park and the grand weight of the government buildings that line that stretch of central London. It's not as famous as Buckingham Palace. Tourists don't queue for it the way they queue for the changing of the guard. But the people who know, know. There are 2 mounted sentries posted at the arch entrance every single day. Red-coated in summer, dark blue in winter. Horses standing like furniture. Guards standing like the horses. That morning, the guard on the left was on a black horse. Tall animal, big-chested, the kind that makes you feel small just by existing. The sentry himself, I later found out his name was Daniel, though I didn't know that yet, was in the dark blue winter tunic of the household cavalry. Gleaming black boots. White plume on the helmet catching the gray morning air. Face completely blank. I'd seen guard before. Every tourist in London has. You walk past, you take a picture, maybe you try to make them laugh because you saw someone do it on YouTube once. Then you walk on. You go get your coffee, and you forget about it. But that morning I didn't walk on. I had 45 minutes before I was supposed to meet my sister at the cafe on the corner of Birdcage Walk, and I had nowhere to be, and something about the way the horse shifted its weight made me stop and actually look. The square was starting to fill up slowly. It wasn't packed yet. This was October, not August, but there were enough people to create that steady tourist murmur. A school group from somewhere on the continent. The kids in matching yellow high-visibility vests. A teacher counting heads with the focused despair of someone who has done this too many times. A Japanese couple, both of them with proper cameras, not phones, the kind with long lenses. An older man in a green wax jacket walking a dog that was not allowed in this area, but which nobody seemed willing to enforce the rule about. 2 American women, I could tell from the voices, standing close to the barrier, one of them holding a paper cup of coffee, the other one pointing at the horse and saying, "Oh my God, he's not moving. Oh my God, look at his face, he's not even blinking." She was wrong about the blinking, but I understood why she thought it. The horse exhaled through its nose. Big, steaming breath in the cold morning air. Daniel, the guard I didn't yet know was called Daniel, did not move. Behind me, the park was doing its autumn thing. Leaves down. Pelicans on the lake. Absurd as always, because the pelicans at St. James's Park are always a surprise no matter how many times you've seen them. A jogger in a high-visibility jacket passing along the path. Pigeons doing pigeon things on the gravel. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly what it should be. And yet, 3. The weight of standing still, I want to try to explain what it actually looks like. When I describe it to people who haven't seen it up close, they usually nod and say, yeah, like a statue, and that's not wrong, but it's also not right. A statue doesn't breathe. A statue doesn't have to try. What the household cavalry sentry does is something that the human body genuinely resists. The body wants to shift. The body wants to roll the ankle slightly, to redistribute weight, to move the jaw just a fraction, to turn the neck a centimeter because something caught the eye. The body has been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years, and one of the core things it learned to do was not stand perfectly still for hours at a time, because perfectly still in the wild usually meant you were already dead. Daniel was doing something that ran against every signal his nervous system was sending him. I know this because I tried it. Not in the square. I'm not that strange, but later when I got home, I stood in my kitchen and tried to stand completely still for 5 minutes. Feet together, Chin level, eyes forward, face neutral. No phone in my hand. Nothing to look at. I lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds before I moved. And I was standing in a warm kitchen with no one watching me, and no heavy ceremonial helmet on my head, and no horse beneath me, and no tourists pushing their children toward me for photographs. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Daniel did 2 hours. Twice a day, with a brief rotation in between, the sentries at horse guard stand their posts. The standard duty is a 2-hour shift, though the exact timing varies with ceremony schedules and seasonal requirements. In the middle of summer, in the full weight of that red tunic and brass breastplate, with the sun hammering down on a black helmet, the heat inside that uniform reaches temperatures that would hospitalize most people. I didn't know the details then. I found them out later after I started asking questions. But standing there that October morning, watching the gray light fall across the parade ground and watching Daniel not move, I had the first edge of the feeling I'm trying to describe. The feeling that there was something happening here that nobody was paying attention to. That everyone was watching, but nobody was seeing. The American woman finished her coffee and crumpled the cup. Her friend was trying to get a selfie with the horse in the background. The school group had moved on, the teachers still counting heads. I stayed. First hour, by the time the first hour had passed, the crowd had shifted and changed several times over. People came, looked, photographed, left. A tour guide arrived with a group of about 15 people, speaking in German, pointing at the arch and the clock and explaining something in rapid, confident sentences. 2 of the group broke away to get closer to the horse. The tour guide called them back without missing a beat in her explanation. Daniel had not moved. Not once. Not in any way that counted. But I had moved closer. Incrementally, over the course of that hour, I had drifted to the left, closer to his position, until I was standing near the low barrier, perhaps 6 or 7 feet from where the horse stood. Close enough to see the condensation of the horse's breath. Close enough to see the small, almost imperceptible rise and fall of Daniel's chest. Close enough, eventually, to see his eyes. And that's where the blink came in. It happened at the 53-minute mark. I know this because I had, at some point, started timing things on my phone, partly out of curiosity and partly because I had nothing else to do. The tour group had gone. A brief lull in the foot traffic. A moment where the parade ground was, if not empty, at least quiet enough that the sound from the park carried over. The geese, someone's phone playing music they hadn't bothered to put headphones in for. Daniel blinked. Not the normal human blink, that quarter-second flutter you do hundreds of times a day without thinking. This was a slow, deliberate blink. Both eyelids coming down fully, staying closed for just a fraction longer than normal, then rising again. His face didn't change. His posture didn't change. The horse didn't react. But in that fraction of a second, with his eyes closed, something moved across his face. I don't know how to describe it exactly. It wasn't pain. It wasn't distress. It was something quieter and more private than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who, for just the duration of a single blink, was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere inside himself, behind a door he had closed very firmly, living in some small interior space where the tourists and the cameras and the gray London sky couldn't reach him. Then his eyes opened, blank again, composed, present. But I had seen it, that fraction of a second, that brief, private disappearance. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. What nobody asks here is what I kept turning over in my mind, standing there with cold feet on the gravel of Horse Guards Parade. Thousands of people walk past this spot every day. Hundreds of thousands every year. They photograph this man. They photograph his horse. They try to make him laugh or flinch or react. They post the photographs online. They tell their friends. Some of them write reviews on travel websites. The guards are amazing, so impressive, very disciplined, definitely worth seeing. And in all of that, in all that attention, all that observation, all that documentation, nobody asks the obvious question. How are you doing? Not in a passing, social way. In the real way. The way you'd ask someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. Are you tired? Are your feet aching? Is there a point in the second hour where the weight of the helmet becomes something you have to actively negotiate with? Do you ever go home and just stay in a hot shower for a very long time and not think about anything? Do you have dreams about being allowed to scratch your nose? I know these sound like strange questions, maybe even disrespectful ones in a particular reading of them, but they don't feel strange to me. They feel like the most natural questions in the world when you have spent an hour watching a person do something genuinely, physically, psychologically difficult, and watching everyone around you treat that person like an architectural feature. The discipline is real. I want to be clear about that. The training is real. The tradition is real. The professionalism is real. None of what I'm saying is meant to undercut any of that. If anything, I think the discipline is more impressive when you understand what it costs. When you understand that it isn't effortless. When you understand that the stillness is not the absence of something, but the presence of something, a constant, active, demanding act of will. The stillness costs, and nobody asks about the bill. 6. A small thing happens. I was thinking about all of this, or the early version of all of this, the unformed version that hadn't yet become words, when a small thing happened. A child had broken away from her parents. She was young, 4, maybe 5. Red coat, blonde hair, and 2 very messy plaits, one welly boot with a mud stain on it. She had the absolute committed forward momentum of a small child who has spotted something interesting and whose legs have already gone ahead while the decision-making part of the brain is still catching up. She was heading for the horse, not in a dangerous way. The barrier was there, and she wasn't near the horse's back legs, which would have been the genuine concern. She was heading for the horse's nose. Kids always head for the nose. They want to touch the velvet of it. Her parents had noticed and were moving, but they were 20 feet behind her, and she was fast for her age. She reached the barrier, looked up. The horse was enormous from ground level. I watched her work this out in real time, her steps slowing slightly, her head tilting further and further back as the full size of the animal registered. But she didn't stop. She reached out one small hand toward the horse's nose. The horse's name, I would later learn, was Sergeant, which I find unreasonably funny, moved his head. Not sharply, not an alarm, just a small sideways shift of a large animal acknowledging something near its nose. Sergeant turned his head perhaps 15 degrees and regarded the small girl with one very large eye. The girl froze, not in fear exactly, more in that complete arrested astonishment of a child who has encountered something real, something alive and enormous and utterly unimpressed by her for the first time. And Daniel moved. It was almost nothing. A single degree of movement, a micro-adjustment of his posture, a slight downward tilt of his chin. His eyes moved. I saw them move to the girl. Just briefly. Just enough to confirm what was happening. Just enough to take in the situation. His face didn't change. His body didn't change. But his eyes had moved, and in them, just for a second, I saw something. Something that wasn't discipline, and wasn't training, and wasn't centuries of military tradition. I saw someone who was paying attention. Really paying attention, in the full, human sense of the word. The girl's father arrived. Scooped her up, laughing, apologizing to nobody in particular, the girl now wriggling and wanting to be put down and pointing back at the horse. They moved away. Sergeant returned his head to neutral. Daniel's chin returned to level. Everything exactly as it had been, except I had seen it. That flash of genuine human attention. That microsecond of care for a small girl in a red coat. My phone buzzed. My sister at the cafe. Where are you? I've ordered you a flat white. I started walking, but I kept looking back. My sister Rachel ordered me a flat white and a slice of something involving lemon and almonds because she knows me and she could tell from the way I sat down that I'd been doing what she calls my watching thing. You were staring at the guards again, she said. Not a question. One guard, I said. For about an hour. She put down her cup. An hour. He didn't move. Not once. Well, he blinked. Once. She looked at me for a moment the way she's looked at me since we were children, which is the look of someone who has long since made peace with the particular frequency on which my brain operates. Then, she picked her cup back up. Did you talk to him? You can't talk to him. That's the whole point. You're not allowed, and he can't respond anyway. I meant after, when his shift ends. I hadn't thought of that. I genuinely hadn't thought of that. I had spent an hour watching this man, and it had never occurred to me that there was an after, that the shift ended, that Daniel took off the helmet and the tunic and became, by some alchemy I couldn't quite picture, just a person again. How would I started. You'd figure it out, Rachel said. You always do. 2. The regiment, I didn't figure it out that day. But I went home and I started reading because that's what I do when something gets into my head and won't come out. The Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment is one of 2 regiments, the other being the Foot Guards, that provide what is called the Sovereign's Bodyguard at the principal royal residences and during state ceremonies. They are, in the language that surrounds them, the oldest and most senior regiment of the British Army. The Life Guards, who were the Red Tunics, trace their origins to the guards of King Charles II during his exile. The Blues and Royals, who were the dark blue, the regiment Daniel belonged to, have a history that stretches back to the English Civil War. None of this is obscure information. You can find it in any number of places. But reading it that evening at my kitchen table, I found myself slowing down in places I usually skim. The training, for example. Before a soldier is permitted to mount a ceremonial sentry post, they go through months of training at Hyde Park Barracks in Knightsbridge. The riding school alone occupies a significant part of this. Soldiers who have never sat on a horse in their lives learn to ride. Not just to get on and stay on, but to ride properly in the military sense, which means hands light, seat deep, legs still, the kind of riding that looks effortless from the outside and is anything but. Then there is the ceremonial drill, the posture, the stillness, learning to stand in such a way that the natural human fidget, the constant micro-adjustments that a body makes just to maintain equilibrium, is suppressed. Not eliminated, because you can't eliminate it, but suppressed, brought down to something so small it's invisible to the casual observer. Then there are the horses themselves, big animals. Cavalry horses are not small or gentle. They are trained, yes, and they're selected for temperament, but they're still horses, still capable of shying, still sensitive to noise and sudden movement, still possessed of the deep evolutionary instinct that makes prey animals unpredictable in a way that predator animals simply aren't. A mounted sentry is, at any given moment, managing a 1,200-pound animal with his legs and seat and the particular quality of his own stillness, and doing it invisibly so that the horse looks as composed as the rider. And he is doing all of this in a uniform that was designed in an era when central heating didn't exist and air conditioning was centuries away, and which has been updated for the horse's comfort more recently than it has been updated for the riders. I sat with this for a while. Then I went back to the part about the summer duties, the heat, and I read it properly this time, not skimming. In August, when the tourist season peaks, and the London sun does what it occasionally does, and actually means it, the temperature inside the full ceremonial uniform of the lifeguards, the red tunic, the white plume, the steel cuirass front and back, the black leather riding boots, can exceed the ambient temperature by 30 or 40 degrees. There have been instances of sentries losing consciousness. It is, by any reasonable measure, a genuine physiological challenge. The regiment has protocols. There are support staff watching. There are procedures for rotation and for managing heat casualties. But the posts are still filled. Every day, summer and winter, rain and shine. Public holidays when the tourists come in such numbers that the square fills up, and the noise is constant, and the hands reaching toward the horses never quite stop. Every day, I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet for a bit. 3. Back to the square. 2 weeks later, I went back. Of course I went back. It was a Tuesday this time, early November. The weather had finally committed to proper autumn, cold and clear, and with that particular low-angle London light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is, as if the city knows it's being photographed. I wore 2 layers and still felt the cold in my fingers by the time I reached the arch-different guard this time. Lifeguards, the red tunic, which I hadn't seen in October. The horse was a chestnut this time, a copper-bright animal with a long face, fidgeting slightly more than Sergeant had. The sentry was very young. Early 20s, I would guess, maybe younger. He had that quality that very young people in uniform sometimes have, where the discipline and the youth exist simultaneously in the face in a way that is faintly jarring. You see the training, and you also see the person who, 2 or 3 years ago, was probably playing video games in a bedroom somewhere. His name, I found this out much later through a sequence of events I'll get to, was Connor. He was 40 minutes into his shift when I arrived. The crowd that day was thinner than it had been in October. The deep-season tourists, the dedicated ones, the ones who come to London in November on purpose. A retired couple, both of them with proper walking shoes, and the satisfied air of people who know how to travel. A young woman on her own with a notebook, sitting on one of the benches against the wall, writing something. A group of men who might have been on a work trip of some kind, one of them trying to get the others interested in the guard while the others looked at their phones. I stood to the right of the barrier this time, roughly 10 feet from Connor's position. The thing that struck me first that day was different from what had struck me the first time. That first time, it had been the stillness. This time, what struck me was the noise. I had somehow not registered the first visit how loud Horse Guards Parade actually is. Not loud in a music venue sense, but loud in a layered, relentless sense. The traffic on Whitehall, a constant broad murmur. A bus changing gear somewhere on Horse Guards Road. A child crying somewhere in the park. Someone's phone ringing, a song I almost recognized. The retired couple talking to each other in low voices. A siren in the middle distance, building and fading. And Connor was standing in the middle of all of it. Eyes forward, face neutral, not blocking it out. Exactly, you can't block things out when you're standing still in an open space. Your ears are just there doing their job. But not reacting to it either. Processing it and releasing it, like being in a river and learning to let the current move around you instead of knocking you over. I thought about that. The active nature of it. The fact that stillness is not passivity. The fact that what looked from the outside like absence of movement, absence of expression, absence of response, was actually presence of a very particular and demanding kind. For the moment the crowd turned, I'm going to describe what happened next carefully, because I want to get it right. There was a man. He had arrived at some point while I was thinking about the noise. Late 30s, maybe 40, in a gray coat, carrying a paper bag from a bakery somewhere. I could see the logo, one of the chains. He had the look of someone who was in the general area for something else and had wandered over for a few minutes to have a look. Not a tourist with a camera, just a man with a pastry and some time. He watched Connor for a while. Then he moved a little closer to the barrier. Then he said something. I couldn't hear exactly what. He wasn't speaking loudly, and the Whitehall traffic was doing its thing. But I saw the shape of it, saw his mouth moving, saw that he was directing whatever he was saying at Connor specifically, at the face, at the blank composure of it. Connor did not react. The man said something else, a little louder this time, and I caught the end of it. The last word, or the last few words, which were something like just standing there, and the tone of them was not friendly. Not aggressive exactly. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, but there was something in the register of it. Something dismissive. The tone of a man who had looked at the uniform and the stillness and had decided that what he was seeing was performance without substance. Spectacle without significance. Something you put up for the tourists. Just standing there. I felt something tighten in my chest. Connor did not react. His eyes didn't move. His face didn't change. His hands, in their gauntlets on the reins, did not shift. The man stood for another moment, then made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one, and walked away toward Whitehall, his paper bag swinging. I watched him go. Then I looked back at Connor, and here's what I want to tell you about. The 3 seconds after the man walked away. Because in those 3 seconds with the man's back turned and the crowd momentarily arranged in such a way that Connor had a fraction more privacy than usual. In those 3 seconds, I saw something. His jaw moved. Barely. The smallest possible clench. The kind that happens when someone is holding something in their mouth that they very much want to say out loud. Then it was gone. Jaw relaxed. Face neutral. Eyes forward. But I had seen it. The clench. The hell breath. The private, invisible act of absorbing something unpleasant and choosing deliberately, actively choosing, not to respond to it. I thought, that is not easy. That is one of the hardest things a person can do. Someone has just been dismissive to your face, and you're not allowed to say a single word back, and you do not say a single word back, and then you let it go, or you try to let it go, or you put it somewhere and come back to it later in private where nobody can see. That is not empty. That is not just standing there. That is something. The rotation at the 90-minute mark. I had been there for 50 minutes by this point. The rotation happened. I had read about this, but hadn't seen it before. The relief sentry comes out. There is a brief formal exchange. The outgoing sentry walks his horse back to the yard while the new one takes the post. It happens with military precision. Takes perhaps 4 minutes from start to finish, and by the time it's done, the crowd has barely registered that anything changed. What I watched in those 4 minutes was not the ceremony. It was Connor. As the relief sentry took the post, and Connor began to walk his horse away from the arch, toward the yard at the back of the building, I watched his posture change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but over the course of perhaps 30 seconds of walking, I watched the absolute rigidity of the ceremonial position, spine vertical, hands precisely placed, chin exactly level, shift into something more human. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The chin came down. The hands, still holding the reins properly, lost that particular quality of controlled tension that I hadn't even consciously noticed until it was releasing. He rode through the arch and disappeared from view. I stood there for a moment. A tourist had appeared next to me. Young woman, Australian accent, asking her companion if they were going to do the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace later. I was thinking about what I'd just seen. The release. The way a body unclenches when the obligation temporarily lifts. The way the performance ends and the person comes back. Because that's what it is. I don't mean performance in a pejorative sense. I mean it in the precise sense. The public face, the composed face, the face that is required and maintained and held in place with enormous effort, and then the moment when the requirement lifts and the face can just be a face again. Connor rode through that arch, and for a brief, unobserved moment, while unobserved by almost everyone, he was not the guard. He was just a young man on a horse, with a jaw that had been clenched longer than was comfortable, heading somewhere warm. I wondered if he got tea. I found myself hoping he got tea. 6. What Rachel said, I told Rachel about it that evening. The man with the paper bag. The jaw clench. The way the body had changed on the ride back through the arch. She listened in the way she does, which is actually listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. You know what gets me? She said when I'd finished. The man was wrong about what he was seeing, and he was confident about being wrong. Yes, I said. He looked at all that, the training, the discipline, the whole thing, and he saw nothing. He decided it was nothing. He decided it was easy, I said, or empty, something like that. She was quiet for a moment. That's what people do when they don't want to think too hard about something. They call it easy. They say it's just for show. It's easier than asking what it actually costs. I've been thinking about that ever since. It's easier than asking what it actually costs. Because if you ask that question, if you actually ask it, you have to sit with the answer. You have to think about a young man in his early 20s standing in the cold for 2 hours at a stretch, twice a day, in a uniform that was not designed with his comfort in mind, absorbing the full spectrum of human behavior from the people who walk past him. The respectful ones, the oblivious ones, the ones with cameras, the ones with dismissive comments, and choosing every single day to stand there anyway. Choosing to meet it with the same composed face, the same level eyes, the same stillness that costs so much and looks so effortless. And if you ask that question properly, you end up with a feeling that's more complicated than the neat admiration the reviews talk about. You end up with something closer to awe, and also something closer to guilt. Guilt for every time you walked past and didn't think. For every photograph you took and moved on from. For every time you let the uniform do its work of making the person invisible. I went back a third time. I went back on a Friday in mid-November. The sky had finally delivered on its weeks-long threat and was raining in that London way. Not dramatically, not in sheets, but persistently, the fine gray drizzle that settles into everything and makes the city look like it's been printed on slightly damp paper. I had my umbrella. I wore proper boots this time. I had a coffee in a thermos because I had learned my lesson about cold feet and cold hands and how they interfere with the ability to think clearly. Horse Guards Parade in the rain is a different place. The casual tourist traffic drops significantly. The people who are there in that kind of weather are either on a schedule, school trips, tour groups with the commitment of prepaid tickets, or they're the kind of people who have decided that weather is not a reason to change plans. There were perhaps 30 people in the square when I arrived. Maybe fewer. The horses glistened. The guard that morning was neither Daniel nor Connor. It was a woman. I hadn't expected that, though I don't know why I hadn't. The household cavalry has had women serving in a mounted regiment for some years now, and it hadn't occurred to me that I might have been, in my imagination, composing this story around a specific gender. But seeing her there in the full ceremonial kit, on a large gray horse with a white blaze, I felt something shift in the frame of what I was thinking about. Her name, I would learn eventually, was Corporal Reeve. At the time, she was simply the guard on the left, and she was standing in the rain with exactly the same composure as every other guard I had watched, and the rain was landing on the brim of her helmet and falling in a small, steady stream that she was, of course, not bothering to do anything about. The rain made the whole thing stranger, more exposed, somehow, like the weather had stripped away the last of the decorative quality and left just the bare fact of it. A person in uncomfortable clothes standing in the rain because that is the job. I stood under my umbrella and watched. 2. The question I finally got to ask, the sequence of events that led me to Daniel, is a longer story than I have space for here, but the short version is this. A friend of a friend knew someone who was in the regiment, and after several weeks of asking in the right direction, I was connected cautiously, informally, over a pub lunch with someone who was willing to talk. His name was Marcus. He had served in the mounted regiment for 9 years. He was no longer in the mounted role. He had moved into a different posting, but he had done the horse guard's duty for 3 years in his late 20s. He was compact and quiet and had the manner of someone who thinks carefully before they speak. I told him what I'd been thinking about. The blink, the jaw clench, the way the body changed on a ride back through the arch. The man with the paper bag, and what he'd said. Marcus listened. He let me finish. Then he picked up his pint and looked at it for a moment. The thing people don't understand, he said, is that the stillness is the job. Not a demonstration of the job. Not a symbol of the job. The job itself. He put the pint down. You're not standing still to show people you can stand still. You're standing still because the post requires it. Because the presence, the actual physical presence, the body in that specific spot, composed, in uniform, representing something, is the work. And the work is hard. How hard? I asked. He thought about it. Summer is the worst. People know about the heat. It gets written about. But they think it's a heat thing, like you're hot. That's uncomfortable. It's not just that. It's the cumulative thing. It's February in a cold year when the horse won't settle and you can't feel your toes and there's a school group that's been standing near you for 15 minutes and the teacher hasn't moved them on. It's the day when you're not sleeping well for some reason and your second hour feels 3 times as long as your first. It's all the days that aren't anybody's worst day, but are also just days. Days that you have to get through. And you get through them the same way you get through the hard ones, which is the same way you get through the easy ones, which is 1 minute at a time. Does it get easier? With experience, your body gets stronger. Your endurance gets better. But it doesn't get easier because it's not a physical problem you solve and then you've solved it. You solve it every shift. And then you come back tomorrow and you solve it again. I sat with that for a moment. The man with the paper bag, I said. The dismissive comment. Does that happen a lot? Marcus looked at the table. Yes, not always that direct. Sometimes it's just how people look at you. Like you're a prop. like you're part of the scenery. You can feel when someone's looking at you as a thing rather than a person. After a while, you get good at knowing the difference. He paused. You still feel it, though. Every time. The not seeing. You feel it. And you can't say anything. No. Ever. There are specific circumstances where speech is permitted. Safety situations, specific formal commands. But not, he stopped. Not for something like that. No. I thought about the jaw clench. About what it takes to absorb something and choose not to respond and then let it go. What do you do with it? I asked. When someone says something like that. For the first time, Marcus smiled. It was a small smile. Not a happy smile exactly. More the smile of someone who has been asked a question that gets at something real. You breathe, he said. You take the next minute. And then you take the one after that. And at some point the shift ends and you ride back and you take the kid off and he shrugs slightly. You get on with it. Does anyone ask? I said, when you come back in, does anyone say, are you okay? How is it? That looked like a hard one. He picked up his pint again. Not really, he said. No. 3. What Corporal Reeve did next, I want to go back to the Friday in November. The rain. Corporal Reeve on the gray horse. I was there for approximately 90 minutes that day, and for the first hour, nothing happened that I hadn't seen before. The rain kept the crowd manageable. The horse, whose name I later gathered was Marquis, was calm and steady, standing with the particular indifference of a horse that has seen everything. Corporal Reeve was perhaps 15 minutes from her rotation when the thing happened. An elderly man had been standing near the barrier for some time. He was alone, no companion, no group, no tour guide. He had the slight unsteadiness of someone whose knees weren't what they used to be, and he had a proper old-fashioned umbrella, the solid black kind, which he was leaning on slightly as he stood there. He'd been watching Marquis with an expression I found hard to read at first. Not the tourist expression, not the casual curiosity, something more specific, something that belonged to a particular kind of looking. After a while, I decided he was someone who knew horses. He was looking at Marquis the way a person who has spent time around horses looks at them, not at the spectacle, but at the animal itself. The set of the ears, the relaxation in the hindquarters, the way the weight was distributed through the legs. He was assessing, appreciating in a technical sense. He'd been there maybe 20 minutes when the thing happened. His umbrella slipped. Not dramatically, just the rubber tip on the wet stone, a wobble, his hand tightening on it just in time. But for a second he'd lurched, and his balance had been briefly uncertain. Corporal Reeve moved. Again, almost nothing, but I was watching closely enough by that point to catch it. Her right hand shifted, not off the reins, not far, just a readiness shift. The kind of shift that a person makes when they're about to do something, preloading the movement before the decision is consciously made. Her eyes moved to the elderly man, stayed there, assessed. He recovered, straightened up, adjusted his grip on the umbrella, gave a small, slightly embarrassed laugh that was really just for himself. Corporal Reeve's hand settled back. Her eyes returned to neutral, but she had been ready. In whatever small way was available to her, within the constraints of her post, she had been ready to respond. The whole formal apparatus of the ceremonial position, the stillness, the composure, the deliberate absence of reaction, had been, for that 1 second, quietly set aside in favor of something more fundamental, in favor of paying attention to whether someone nearby was about to fall. I keep coming back to this moment. It's a small moment. It doesn't make for a dramatic story. Nobody photographed it. The elderly man probably doesn't remember it, or if he does, doesn't know what he was seeing. But it tells you something. It tells you that inside the stillness, inside the composed and disciplined exterior that people look at and photograph and occasionally dismiss, there's a person who is fully present, fully awake, taking in the crowd and the weather and the horse and the small elderly man with the umbrella, processing it all, ready to act when action is needed and standing exactly still when it isn't. That is not emptiness. That is attention in its most concentrated form. 4. Daniel. The full story I found out about Daniel through Marcus. It took a few more weeks, and another quiet conversation. And by the time I was told what I'm about to tell you, it was December, and the Christmas lights were up along Whitehall, and the tourist numbers had dropped enough that Horse Guards felt, briefly, like it belonged to the city again instead of to the world. Daniel had been on the Household Cavalry for 7 years. He joined at 18, straight from school, from a town in the West Midlands that he didn't talk about much. He'd wanted to join since he was 12. He'd seen the Mounted Regiment in a documentary and had set his mind to it with the kind of quiet, permanent decision that some people make young and never revise. He'd done the full training, the riding school, the drill, the whole accumulation of it. He'd been on ceremonial duty for 4 years at the time I first saw him. That October Thursday, the gray morning, the one blink at 53 minutes. What I didn't know, what I found out from Marcus, who knew him, was that the Thursday I had been there had been a difficult one. Not in any way that showed. Not in any way that the tourists had seen or that anyone had asked about. Daniel had been dealing with something personal. I'm not going to say what it was because it's not mine to say, and Marcus was careful about it, and I'm going to be careful about it too. Something in his private life. The kind of thing that, in a normal job, might lead you to call in and say you needed a day. The kind of thing that, in a lot of jobs, would be considered sufficient reason to not be fully functional. He had not called in. He had come to work. He had put the kit on, and then he had stood at his post for 2 hours on a gray October morning, and not once in those 2 hours had he let any of it show. One blink, one private, 53-minute disappearance behind a door in himself. That was all. When Marcus told me this, I didn't say anything for a moment. Does he know I was watching him? I asked eventually. No. Why would he? Does he know that anyone noticed? Marcus shook his head slightly. Nobody asks, he said. And the way he said it wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. A thing that was true, that had always been true, that would probably always be true. Nobody asks. V. The thing about discipline, I want to try to say this carefully, because I think it matters. There's a version of this story that treats discipline as the opposite of humanity, where the discipline is the mask, and what I've been looking for is the person underneath it, where the military training is the thing that suppresses the real feelings, and what I want to uncover is the suppression. That's not what I think. What I came to think over those weeks of watching and the conversations that followed, is that discipline is human. That it's one of the most profoundly human things there is. That the ability to make a commitment and keep it, not because it's easy, not because anyone is watching in the way that counts, but because you said you would, is not a denial of the inner life. It's an expression of it. Daniel had something hard in his personal life, and he came to work, and he stood his post. That is not the absence of emotion. That is emotion being carried quietly, privately, without complaint for the duration of the shift. That is the weight of a human life being held inside a composed exterior, not because the human life doesn't matter, but because the job matters too, and he had decided they could coexist. The jaw clench I saw in Connor, that wasn't discipline failing. That was discipline succeeding. That was a young man absorbing something unpleasant and finding a way to process it that didn't disrupt the post, didn't startle the horse, didn't make the crowd uncomfortable. He held it. He let it go. He took the next minute. And Corporal Reeve, in the rain, with her hand shifting toward readiness on the reins, that wasn't a crack in the composure. That was the full person behind the composure, awake and present and ready. The discipline didn't make her less human. It focused what was human about her, the way a lens focuses light into something exact and purposeful and precise. The discipline is not the mask. The discipline is the frame. Inside the frame, entirely, is a person. And that person is exhausted and careful and proud and occasionally stung by thoughtless words and watchful over small children and elderly men with umbrellas and able on the hardest days to blink once, just once, and come back. 6. What I think about now, it's been months since October. Since the first Thursday, the gray morning, the moment I noticed the blink. I walk past Horse Guards parade sometimes on my way to other things. I don't always stop, but when I do stop, when I stand for a few minutes and look at whoever is on post that day, I try to carry what I learned. I try to see the person, not as a way of diminishing the ceremony. The ceremony is real, and the history is real, and the tradition has weight that I didn't fully appreciate before I started paying attention. I try to see the person because the ceremony only works, has only ever worked, because the persons inside it are carrying it. Because someone is choosing every single day to stand still when everything in the body says move. To be present when presence is hard. To hold the line between public duty and private life in a way that makes the line invisible to everyone watching. The praise comes easily. So impressive. Such discipline. Amazing dedication. It does come. I'm not saying it doesn't. I've said versions of it myself before I knew what I was really talking about. But the other question, the quieter, harder question, doesn't come as easily. How are you? Are you okay? Was today a hard one? It costs almost nothing to ask. And I think it might mean more than most people know. 7. The ending. I went back one more time. January. Dry and bitterly cold. The kind of cold that doesn't move, just settles over the city and stays there. The guard on the right that day was Daniel. I recognized him. Same build, same bearing. Though maybe I was projecting. Maybe I'd convinced myself. Either way, I stood where I could see his face, and I stood there for a while, and the cold came in through my coat, and my feet went numb at the edges, and the city made its usual sounds around us. He didn't move. Not once. The horse stood. The cloud sat low and white over the rooftops. At some point, a small boy of about 6 or 7, on his own for exactly the 30 seconds it takes a child to get ahead of a distracted parent, stopped in front of Daniel's position and looked up, not at the horse, at Daniel's face. Just looked with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a small child who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude. Daniel's eyes moved down, slightly, just enough, and the small boy, receiving that fraction of acknowledgement, that microscopic recognition from within the stillness, did something I didn't expect. He stood up straighter. He put his feet together and his hands at his sides, and he looked forward, and for approximately 5 seconds he was trying, genuinely, wholeheartedly trying, to do what Daniel was doing. To be still, to hold the line, to carry the weight of the moment with composure. He managed about 4 seconds before a pigeon landed nearby and broke the spell. His mother arrived, scooped him up, apologized to the air around her, and carried him away. Daniel's eyes returned to neutral. His face settled back to what it always was. But I watched his posture, and in the very small shift of his shoulders, barely anything less than the small boy's imitation, less than the blink, I thought I saw something. Something lighter than what had been there before. Something that the small boy had put there without knowing it. The recognition that someone, just for 4 seconds, had tried to understand what it costs. That's all any of us want, I think. For someone to try. For someone to stand still for 4 seconds and understand even a fraction of the weight. They praise the discipline. They always will. The photos go up online. The reviews say how impressive it is. The tourists come every day and the cameras click. But in the cold January air on that gravel square between the park and the government buildings, a man stood at his post and carried what he carried, and almost nobody knew what it cost, and nobody asked. And maybe that's part of what he carries too. The being unseen, the visible invisibility, the strange loneliness of being looked at by thousands and known by almost none. He stood there until the rotation came, rode back through the arch. The relief took the post, and the square filled up again, and the tourists came, and they took their pictures, and the new guard stood still, and it cost him something, and nobody asked,